The 1960s were a different time in America. Cynicism had not fully taken root in the nation, but there was a growing generational divide. Traditional ideas of heroes and villains were still firmly rooted in American culture, with the all-American boy considered the ideal citizen who could do no wrong. Of course, it didn't take long for this image to offer perfect cover for one of the United States' most notorious crimes, weaving a tale of adventure, deceit, and murder. Enter Murph the Surf in the anomaly of the biggest jewel heist in American history. Jack Roland Murphy was born in 1939 to Oceanside homemaker Ruth Murphy and her husband, who worked for a telephone company. Jack had a virtuous upbringing which included an interest in the violin and tennis, though he experienced some degree of transiency as his parents moved frequently. His tennis skills and excellent grades awarded him a scholarship at the University of Pittsburgh at the age of 17, remarkable given his youth. He found it difficult to adapt to this new environment, however, and perhaps out of boredom hitchhiked to Miami in the winter of 1955. Here he took up a passion not possible in Pennsylvania, the art of surfing. Mr. Murphy worked odd jobs for the next few years in hotels as he supported his surfer lifestyle. He boasted legendary skills on the waves, lending him the nickname Murph the Surf. His swarthy charm and skill with the violin won the hearts of many, and it is said he charismatically snuck his way into meeting the Beatles. One wealthy hotel patron in particular, Gloria Sawstock, was courted by Mr. Murphy. They married after just 9 days and produced 2 sons. Somewhere along the way, he also met a man named Alan Kuhn, who he worked with at Miami Beach's Casablanca Hotel. Mr. Kuhn had come from a troubled background and spent time in the Navy before meeting Jack Murphy. The two were swimming instructors. In 1962, Jack and Gloria Murphy divorced. Thanks to his reputation as a master surfer, Mr. Murphy soon attracted a second wife, with whom he moved to Cocoa Beach. The couple opened up a surf shop while Jack continued honing his craft. One year later, Mr. Murphy competed in the first Virginia Beach Surfing Carnival, later renamed the East Coast Surfing Championships, and won handily. Despite his successes, his surf shop had been facing financial difficulties and was shut down. His second marriage couldn't bear these struggles, and so he divorced not long after. Mr. Murphy moved back to Miami Beach from here. Needing quick money, Mr. Murphy found himself involved with a group planning the overnight burglary of a nearby mansion. The group was successful, and Mr. Murphy made an easy $15,000. He was later joined by Alan Kuhn on operations, and the two became veritable partners in crime from here. In an interview with Vanity Fair, he explained the duo had connections at hotels all across the city, collecting a massive amount of master keys. Though Mr. Kuhn was reluctant to use violence, Mr. Murphy was unfazed. Mr. Murphy became addicted to the thrills of his outlaw lifestyle, including many nighttime getaways by speedboat along with the riches he came into. Alan Kuhn was comparatively more conservative than Jack Murphy, who brazenly flashed the spoils of his thefts at local bars and through extravagant purchases. The pair were soon joined by a third accomplice, Roger Clark, who was employed doing odd jobs at the time. Mr. Clark was not a career criminal like the other two, and seemed to come about the work almost by accident. The trio began arousing suspicion in Florida, but skirted any real prosecution with the help of noted consigliere Harvey St. John. In 1964, they decided to skip town. Mr. Murphy's motivations for leaving Florida were certainly merited, but why he chose Manhattan remains somewhat of a mystery. Some accounts state he had the vision for a grand jewel heist from the outset, partially spurred on by boredom with comparatively smaller theft. They stayed at the Cambridge House Hotel, where staff recall lavish parties during their stay. Mr. Murphy studied the nearby American Museum of Natural History, paying close attention to their impressive J.P. Morgan jewel collection. He had a particular affinity for the DeLong Star Ruby and the Star of India Sapphire. Mr. Murphy noted that there was almost no security presence at the museum, making it an irresistible target. October 29, 1964. The trio settled on the plans for their caper. Mr. Murphy initially had reservations about the feasibility of escape, but was pressed on by Mr. Kuhn. They scaled the iron gates and roped themselves up to the 4th floor of the museum, where the jewel collection lay. The window was unlocked. They never encountered guards, and it seemed the alarm system was disconnected, either because it hadn't been turned on, or because it was broken. Finding the jewel collection was hardly difficult. Mr. Murphy and his accomplices were able to spend hours at their leisure bagging up the gemstones, said to be worth at least $500,000. No one stopped or even noticed the thieves as they disappeared with their spoils. The thieves made quite a mess in the museum, and it wasn't long before the media arrived. The museum's director blamed the security pitfalls on a lack of funding. Unsurprisingly, the jewels were not insured. Police in every state were told to be on the lookout, and the search for the jewels made international headlines. Meanwhile, the group had flown back to Miami under fake names the morning after the heist. The authorities were tipped off, though, by a bellhop at the Cambridge House Hotel, who recalled their wild nightly parties through their planning phase. The thieves were caught 48 hours later on Halloween and released on bail. They had stored most of their cash in a Miami bus station, although one of the diamonds was cut up, sold, and remains lost. The DeLong Star ruby was also nowhere to be found, though authorities saw this as the thieves being uncooperative with the investigation. There is speculation that an associate of the men, named Dick Pearson, had taken the ruby, but this remains a mystery. It was later ransomed to authorities through a middleman and the unknown individual who held on to it. Authorities had difficulty making charges stick to Mr. Murphy and Mr. Coon. One prosecutor remarked that the pair seemed to be treated by the public like folk heroes rather than criminals. He attempted to have them charged with the robbery of actress Eva Gabor and her husband, but this was thrown out when Miss Gabor failed to show up to court as she was filming a movie. On April 6, 1965, Mr. Murphy and Mr. Coon were charged with first-degree burglary and offered a plea deal for their roles in the robbery. Mr. Murphy was given a 21-month reduced sentence, which he served at Rikers Island. Mr. Murphy and Mr. Coon had gone separate ways with Roger Clark, who returned to an unassuming life. The pair went back to Miami Beach by 1967. Sources claim Mr. Murphy suffered from a cocaine addiction at this point, though he hid this behind his usual suave surfer image. Though arrested for suspected theft on the West Coast, Mr. Murphy and Mr. Coon were released when this could not be proven. In one other escapade, Mr. Murphy had pistol-whipped an elderly woman who he thought was wasting his time during a stick-up. But it wasn't long before Jack Murphy was implicated in something far more serious. Mr. Murphy continued bouncing between Miami and Los Angeles. In this time, he had come to know a man named Jack Griffith, with whom he and two former employees from the brokerage firm Rootner, Jackson & Gray conspired to steal almost $500,000 in stocks off the company. The women, Terry Ray Frank and Annelle Marie Moan, had moved in with Mr. Murphy back in Florida by the time the theft was discovered. Supposedly, Mr. Murphy and Mr. Griffith were vacationing with the women along the Intracoastal Waterway when an argument over the stolen money broke out. When one of the ex-secretaries threatened to talk to authorities, the two were bludgeoned and shot to death before being thrown into the Whiskey Creek near North Miami. The bodies had been fitted with concrete blocks to help them sink. The bodies were discovered and the case became known as the Whiskey Creek Murders. Mr. Murphy and Mr. Griffith were charged in the death of 24-year-old Terry Ray Frank, with the latter sentenced to 45 years hard labor. Mr. Murphy, who received a charge of first-degree murder, evaded trial at first through his lawyer's defense of insanity. He was committed, later being found fit for trial. He was handed a double life sentence plus 20 years for his added involvement in the attack on the elderly socialite. Mr. Murphy began serving his sentence at Florida State Prison at Stark in March of 1969. Recounting his early years in prison, Mr. Murphy described himself as a bad person who dipped his hand in the prison drug exchange, gambling, and more. Taking a leadership role in a 1971 prison strike landed him 7 months of solitary confinement. Around this time, new rehabilitation programs were being introduced to prisons, including in-house missionaries. Mr. Murphy recalled being handed a tract, which he initially dismissed, instead seeing it as a good rolling paper. He would make more appearances over the next few months, though he claimed it was simply for the free coffee and donuts. Mr. Murphy was apparently impressed by the conviction certain imprisoned gang members found in their faith. One preacher reached out to him by presenting Christ as a rebel who fought against the rich, something Mr. Murphy evidently identified with. He later recalled a conversation where he admitted that although he loved the thrill of a life of crime, he believed he was out of control. By 1975, Mr. Murphy had become convinced his calling was to find redemption in a spiritual way. His dedication was noticed by both inmates and staff, the latter of whom wondered if it was merely another one of his cons. But Mr. Murphy was persistent. Florida's Parole Board chose to take a chance on him, as his newfound ministry work demonstrated he was on the path to reformation. He quit smoking cannabis and enrolled in Alcoholics Anonymous. Along the way, he found a passion for painting thanks to an ABC reporter named Mary Catherine Collins. She was part of a filming crew working on a documentary at the prison when they met. Miss Collins took interest in his rehabilitation and provided an outlet for Mr. Murphy to regain the social skills he lost while in jail. Mr. Murphy transferred to a halfway house called The Bridge in Orlando, Florida by 1984. He provided counseling to at-risk youth from here and did not give interviews. Then, after serving 16 years for his crimes, Jack Murphy was paroled. He ascribed his good fortune to faith in God, though some continued to doubt how strong his faith would hold after release. Nevertheless, Mr. Murphy began lecturing at universities and colleges across America about his prison experience. He took part in the National Prison Invasion, a Christian Bible study initiative offered at hundreds of prisons. Mr. Murphy took Miss Collins as his third and final wife, and the couple remains married and active in the lives of their grandchildren, whom they homeschool. Murph and Kitten, as they refer to each other, are still involved in prison reformation and advocacy programs. As for his old partner Alan Kuhn, he remains difficult to find. He keeps an unlisted phone number and avoids talking about his troubled past, and had fallen out of touch with Mr. Murphy for many years before they reconnected in 2004. Murph the Surf has continued his public speaking. As of 2012, he had spoken in over 1,500 prisons and given countless lectures abroad, including talks in Jerusalem and in an old gulag in Siberia. He maintains his trademark sense of humor and wit through his conversations on religious topics, which he continues to champion. Mr. Murphy takes some pride in having avoided the fate of his criminal equals from history, who he notes all met a tragic end from their failure to change their ways. Having spent most of the last 35 years out of prison continuing a mission of service offers some hope that even the most hardened offenders are capable of reformation.